Amirawa. Thank you for joining us. I am Aaliyah Chavez. This week, we're focusing on a painful period for Indigenous communities, and that is the era of boarding schools. These institutions left a lasting impact on generations in both the U.S. and Canada, where they were called residential schools. In Canada, September 30th is Orange Shirt Day, honoring Indigenous lives lost and those who never returned home. It's a national day for truth and reconciliation, first recognized in 2021. As we continue to learn more about the impact of boarding schools, efforts to uncover the full scope of their legacy are finally coming to light. Through the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, we are seeing the extent of the harm done to the countless children and their families. Stewart Huntington has the latest on this multi-year investigation by the Department of the Interior, shedding new light on this difficult history.
The 3-year effort was undertaken under the leadership of Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who stressed that the boarding school era was an ugly component of an ugly history.
As the federal government moved the country west, they also moved to exterminate, eradicate, and assimilate Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. The languages, cultures, religions, traditional practices, and even the history of Native communities, all of it was targeted for destruction. Nowhere is that clearer than in the legacy of federal Indian boarding schools.
Interior's report for the first time attempted to quantify the era that stretched from the 19th century to 1969. The report identifies 417 boarding schools and more than 1,000 other institutions with similar assimilation missions. It found 74 marked or unmarked burial sites and put the number of students who died at the schools at 973, a grim tally that is sure to grow as the inquiry continues. The report also called for an apology, investments, a national memorial, and reparations, among other recommendations. It is a dramatic report on a traumatic era.
Ani, nibana mikana bamose Indigenous, mayangandoden. I want to thank the members of our team here at the department who helped put this report together. It's been an exhausting and emotional effort for them to confront this horror on a daily basis, to bring this information to you. Federal Indian boarding schools have had a lasting impact on Native people and communities across America. And that impact continues to influence the lives of countless families, from the breakup of families and tribal nations, to the loss of languages and cultural practices and relatives. This has left lasting scars for all Indigenous people. There's not a single American Indian, Alaska Native, or Native Hawaiian in this country whose life hasn't been affected by these schools.
As we uncover more about the legacy of boarding schools, we see communities taking action to honor the lives that were lost. In Rapid City, South Dakota, a unique park is being constructed on the grounds of a former boarding school. It serves as a memorial to the children who never made it home. Shirley Snavy visited the site to see how this land is being transformed into a place of remembrance and healing.
It's gone now, but this handsome building was a familiar sight on Canyon Lake Drive for 135 years. Known as Susan, it was part of the Rapid City Indian Boarding School campus. It mirrored the philosophy of Captain Richard Pratt of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, kill the Indian, save the man. And now a memorial to those children who died at this school will honor their memory. Amy Sazu leads this effort.
The really special thing about this place and this piece of land is it's the first public art space memorial built by Indigenous people on Indigenous land and controlled by Indigenous people. This land is held for the Oglala Sioux Tribe, Rosewood Sioux Tribe, and Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, and to create a partnership with them and remembering the children has been really important and meaningful to me too, to have that partnership and support of the tribes, and to build something on trust land in the middle of Rapid City, in the middle of a city municipality, is really special. This story isn't all doom and gloom and sad, focused on the past and these horrible things that have happened to us, despite what people in the community say. We are not focused on the past. We are not focused on historical trauma and all the things that happened to us. We really are looking forward and trying to find ways through it and past it and to heal it. And these are two things I think that can help that, can move that process along, even just to create a place where it can be addressed.
In 1896, 160 acres were purchased for the boarding school. By 1906, it had a 1,200-acre footprint of prime agricultural land in the middle of Rapid City.
The whole west side of Rapid City was used, was part of the boarding school because children were meant to work. Children worked on this land. The land back here, going back by Stevens, from what we've read, was grazing land. And the land down below where Sioux Park is was farmland. And to think this land was used for kids to work on, and our local community sought to benefit from that land instead. Never once thinking that what the right thing might have been, and the right thing would be to include the descendants of those children who worked here, some who died working here, some who were seriously harmed. My uncle Art Zimiga talks about his dad. He worked in that barn that's still over at Oyate Health Center, and he was 11 years old. And I always think I have an 11-year-old, and I just can't even imagine my 11-year-old being in charge of farm equipment and animals. And so the right thing here, is to not only let, the building of this memorial, but to acknowledge that and to have our community understand that their wealth was built on land that was used to colonize children, colonization efforts, assimilation efforts targeted at children.
Adjacent to the memorial is the Oyate Health Center, which is controlled by the 17 tribes across 3 states.
I'm proud of Oyate Health Center. I'm proud that when my children go in there, they're like, this place is so nice. I'm proud that there's a nice place for our people with beautiful art made by our people to adorn the walls. It's a huge step in the right direction, and it shows non-Native people here that we are capable of beautiful things and that we can take care of ourselves given the opportunity to do so.
For ICT, from the homelands of the Lakota Oyate, I'm Shirley Snavy.
While Rapid City honors lost lives, Phoenix, Arizona holds a different part of boarding school history. The Phoenix Indian School, which operated for nearly a century, once forced Native children to leave their cultures behind. Now, its remaining buildings stand as a symbol of resilience, reclaimed by Indigenous communities. Daniel Herrera has the story of this transformation.
As Thomas J. Morgan once said, it's cheaper to educate Indians than to kill them. That was the sentiment at boarding schools all across the United States that tens of thousands of Native American children forcefully attended. Here in downtown Phoenix stands the remnants of the Phoenix Indian Industrial School, a symbol of the U.S. government's attempt to assimilate Native Americans into white Christian society. In its early years of operation, the Phoenix Indian School sought to erase the culture of the young Native American men and women who attended. They were forced to cut their hair and wear military uniforms while marching to and from classes. The men were trained to be laborers, while the women were trained to be domestic workers. Patty Talahonga, a former student of Phoenix Indian School, says this was purposeful.
By virtue of having this word industrial in the name of a school, it shows you where their intent was, and the intent was to create a cheap labor force. So the students in those early years, and I think for up until probably the 70s, the students were not encouraged. They were not educated here with the intent that they would go to college, that they would become their own business person, their own lawyer or doctor.
Like other boarding schools across the U.S., more than 20 known students died while attending the Phoenix boarding school. While many boarding schools had cemeteries where they would bury students that died, Phoenix Indian School did not have a marked graveyard.
Phoenix Indian School was open for 99 years, more than 3 times the length of Carlisle Indian School. Carlisle has a marked graveyard. Here at Phoenix Indian, there is no marked gravesite. And that's a big question. Why isn't there? Was there one? Where was it located?
To this day, questions are raised about possible graveyard sites surrounding the park. In its later years, the conditions at Phoenix Indian School improved.
By the time I came to school here, we were not forbidden to speak our languages. We had actual clubs for the different tribes.
Students were now able to talk in their language and show their culture in a school designed to separate them from it.
True to Native spirit, true to the students who came to school here, they may have been groomed one way, but not all of them followed that plan by the government. So there were students who went to college despite the lack of training here at Phoenix Indian. And then again, also just all of the students who came to school here, what they endured, what they survived, and how they carried on.
After 99 years of operation, the Phoenix Indian School closed its doors in 1990. More than 25 years later, the old music room was repurposed as a visitor center. People could now rent the space to celebrate accomplishments.
The first year that we were open, we had families coming here to rent it for a family graduation dinner. And these were kids whose grandparents came to school here at Phoenix Indian. And now the grandparents were coming back to their old school to celebrate the college graduation of their grandchildren. And it was beautiful. And it was like, look what we're doing in this space that was meant to put us down. So to see them coming back with their grandchildren who are college graduates, I think that says something to the government.
For ICT News, Daniel Herrera.
And now we're going to take a deeper look into the report and the aftermath with two of the country's leading journalists who have been covering this topic. Joining us now is Dana Hedgepeth, who has been a reporter with the Washington Post for 25 years, where she has covered topics including Native American history and stories of Indian boarding school survivors. She's an enrolled member of the Haliwa-Saponi tribe of North Carolina. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you so much for having me.
And ICT's national correspondent, Marionette Pember, who has been writing about boarding schools for decades. A citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, Marionette's book, Medicine River, A Story of Survival and the Legacy of Indian Boarding Schools, chronicling her own family's boarding school experiences, is slated to be released in April by Penguin Random House. Welcome, Marionette.
Hey, Stewart. Good to be here.
All right, the boarding school era as we know it started with the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in the 19th century and lasted into the 1960s. Why now is this topic coming into the forefront? This is a question for both of you, but I want to start with you, Dana.
Well, that's a good question. I think it's probably multi-pronged. It maybe got a jump start in 2021, Stuart, with in Canada, where there was the discovery of Kamloops of possible remains of children. And that started many communities in the United States to exploring and thinking that they should look into their own tribe's history at schools. Deb Haaland, as you know, launched her multi-year investigation and has produced 2 reports looking into the United States history of over 400 schools. So that's where it sort of, I would say, jump-started folks into looking at what happened in the United States.
Marionette, I wonder if you could set the table for us. Where are we now with this history finally coming to the forefront?
Yes, I often, just adding a little bit to what Dana was saying, I often wonder what it is that creates this flashpoint for these sorts of issues that have been ongoing. And then suddenly whatever the media takes notice, the public takes notice, but, whatever went into creating a focus on this issue, I'm really glad that it happened. I think that the United States is just no longer able to ignore its history because there were far more schools here in the United States and far more Native people. So, many more people were impacted here.
If we turn to the report, there were some recommendations in the second volume of the report. The first one calls for the government to apologize for this history. Why has it taken so long? Why has the government not apologized for this obviously a detrimental series of policies?
Well, I think, there's fear, I think, if there were an apology that there would be, reparations would be tied to it. And I think the United States is very averse to that. With our history of enslaving people, I think that perhaps they're afraid of setting a precedent. Canada began doing, a reparations process beginning back in 2008. And they actually had to change elements of their constitution in order to do so. So I don't see the United States being prepared to set up a situation in which they would be potentially required to do reparations. But I think that it's now come to a point where they've got to do something.
Can I pipe in? And I absolutely agree with my friend. And I think the first thing that she said hits the nail on the head. I'm going to be a little more bull in the china shop because that's my style. I think it's absolute fear. We as human beings don't like criticism. We don't like to hear that we have done wrong. And this was a wrong, Stuart. This was a huge wrong. It is the darkest chapter, one of the darkest chapters, I believe, in our history. And, people don't like to choke on their Thanksgiving turkey bones when things are called out of America's dark past history of Native Americans. And I feel pretty strongly, as you can tell, that I think it boils down to just fear. People don't want to look at a dark history. I get the hairs stand up on my arms and I run hot talking about this history. And there's folks out there who say that Indigenous people don't want an apology. I think it's very mixed. I've heard from a number of survivors and descendants that acknowledgement, that really matters to people. And I would not ever underestimate how much a presidential level apology matters. Indigenous people are nations, and this is a nation-to-nation mistake, a huge one that happened. And I know many survivors hope that they sadly live to see that sort of apology. That means a lot, and it sort of hurts me in a way for them when people say, oh, apology doesn't really matter. I think that's rebuffing those folks and not giving them the acknowledgement and respect that they feel that they deserve. I just feel strongly that I've heard from enough folks that apology doesn't matter. And I think the reason it hasn't come is fear, sadly. And it's been a long time for many folks. These survivors are fear of them, sadly. First-hand account survivors. Marion had swing about many of them. I have. And in their 70s and 80s, and they're watching for it. They're really watching for it.
One of the things that strikes me over and over and over again is that it's the broader society, the broader country doesn't understand how these policies affected. It's not a stretch to say every single Native American family, and this is just a deep, deep wound. But somehow these communities have to heal or try to heal. How can they do that?
From the very beginning, I think the relationship between the federal government and Native people has always been inequitable in the sense that the United States has never lived up to its treaty promises and therefore created the system that was in many ways, destined not to fail, but certainly to be woefully inadequate. So we've been struggling with that from the very beginning. And it's been generations of dealing, with these inadequate services, and that never came to us as were promised. So I think, some of course we have continued to survive, and which I think in many ways makes us some of the most tenacious people on the face of the earth, that we have hung on to our languages and cultures to the degree that we have is, phenomenal. And I think it's something perhaps a template for other peoples. However, I think that, quote unquote healing, it sort of assumes that there was a point at which, we had an equitable relationship with the federal government, and we never have. So there's no return to healing, to some of this healthy state. It's always really kind of been toxic and inadequate. I think what would be helpful if just the United States did live up to its treaty requirements, and they spoke of providing us with an education. So let's start. That would be one place to start. A good education. Native people were never averse to Western education. We were averse, of course, to having our cultures and language destroyed. We didn't anticipate that was also the included part of the big goal of federal Indian policy and education. That would be one place to start. And I think living up to the federal government, living up to its promises, to provide adequate health care and so on. I think that, and housing and economic development, I think that would help. Of course, if one is unhoused and doesn't have enough to eat, it's difficult to be mentally well in the state of wellness. So I think, taking a couple of giant steps upstream and meeting their agreed promises would be super instrumental in us.
I want to turn to the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Their work has been instrumental in bringing these issues into the national conversation. One of their priorities is a bill in Congress right now to establish a Truth and Healing Commission. Do you guys think that this is an important step to take here?
I do think it is an important step. Again, you're talking about a national level, a national group. NAPS has done amazing work. Those folks are just really good people. I like to tease them that they are small but mighty. It's not a tease, it's a compliment to their incredible work. They are small, but they are very mighty. They have helped people in healing. They are working to help people in healing. They're wearing many hats. They are also pushing for their legislation, the Truth and Healing Commission. That legislation, I think, if passed, would do a lot to sort of open doors that have been closed. The big key of that legislation, I would say, is the subpoena power. And that scares people. Fear does powerful things. And I think behind closed doors, people are scared of that and what subpoena power could do, especially to the Catholic Church. My friend has done extensive, outstanding, award-winning work of digging, and I mean dogged digging into the Catholic Church. She can speak better to that. But reading her work and talking with her, they're facing an uphill battle. They know that. But that would do a lot to open up and just knowledge, right? Knowledge is powerful. Obviously, I'm in the field of journalism. I believe strongly there's nothing wrong with shining the light. We should all be looking at our histories, and we don't learn from our past. And, I hope that this never, ever happens again. I hear people say, why are they involved in this cause of helping with that legislation and testifying and traveling and teaching school groups? And they say, so that this never happens again. Native people don't think of that. There is no I. In many of our languages, it's always a we. We think of our future generations, and no one wants to see this happen again. I think that legislation opens that up, lays it on the table, and helps people understand the past.
You mentioned the Catholic boarding schools and the religious institutions that ran many of these schools. The government inquiry or discussion, a report on the boarding schools focused on the federal boarding schools. I want to turn now to ask you guys what's not in this report and what still needs to be explored.
Well, I think the Catholic Church's role and Christian churches, okay, the Catholics were not the only, church groups to be involved. However, they did run the majority of the schools. Although it's still sort of it's not clear, not finalized, but, close to 100 schools. And they really benefited tremendously, not so much monetarily, but I think it really raised their status, in the eyes of the American public. So there was very little information on them, and it's difficult to get because, there are various denominations within the Catholic Church that ran some of these schools, and then various orders of nuns, priests, and so on. So it's very scattered information. And also, of course, they only looked at the number that they could find within the federal records, which is rather narrow. And it was an unusual number. It's 973, very specific. However, many of the we know that many of the superintendents of the schools were discouraged from reporting, all of the deaths. And we also know that many children, after they discovered that children were dying so quickly, after they arrived at the schools, they began sending them home when they became, mortally ill. And of course, they passed away at home. And then often they would also share their disease, with their community and the families when they returned home. So that kind of information, we don't have any precise information on that.
I want to thank both of you for the work that you do, have done, and will do. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
For real.
What an important conversation there. Before we end today's show, I want to take a moment to share some news. Today is my last day as the anchor of the ICT Newscast. After 5 years with this company, I am leaving to pursue my next chapter. My journey at ICT started the day after I graduated from journalism school at Stanford University. I began as a reporter here for our digital website, covering the campaign trail and extensively covering the selection and confirmation of Deb Haaland to be the Interior Secretary. Then I got the remarkable opportunity to anchor this show. Here we've had a beautiful journey together. I am particularly proud to have brought you an interview with Vice President Kamala Harris, which was truly a rare moment for our Indigenous communities to hear directly from one of the highest level federal officials in our nation. So before I go, I'd like to say Naitra, which means thank you in my Keres language. Thank you for welcoming me into your homes and for trusting me to tell your stories. I've enjoyed hearing from our elders who remind me the value of having news for Native people. And my heart sinks thinking about the parents who tell me about their babies who immediately recognize our theme music. I'm heartwarmed to know that this show will continue on after I leave, and I do hope that you'll tune in for the future. In the meantime, that is a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, and for the final time from me, stay safe, my relatives.